I'm Kathleen Dunn on the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio for this Monday, the 28th of October. An article in Slate caught our attention titled, "Which Grandparent Are You Most Related to?" Your family tree says you inherited 25% of your ancestry from each. Genetics says you didn't. The author of that piece is our guest this hour. Razib Khan is our guest. He's a blogger for Discover Magazine at Gene Expression, and he is a PhD student right now studying genetics. He is particularly studying the evolutionary genetic structure of the domestic cat. We'll be welcoming phone calls for him because there's a lot that you can do, and he's already done, to figure out the genetic makeup of his daughter. But this could have really profound implications for what we know about ourselves and what diseases we're likely to inherit and what parts of our body are governed by which ancestor. It's really fascinating, and it seems like science fiction, but it's not. He says it's science fact. So thank you very, very much for being with us to talk about all of this. Thank you very much, Razib.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm here?
Yeah, there you are, and here we are, and so let's roll. You asked the question, and let me just ask you that at the beginning here. What is it that makes you who you are genetically? It makes each of us who we are genetically. What do we look at?
Well, I mean, you have about 3 billion base pairs in your sequence, so those are the A, C, T, and Gs, which you know in your DNA. And a subset of those vary within the population, and those are very informative, and they vary from person to person. So, for example, that's why some people have brown hair, some people have blonde hair, some people have blue eyes. Those are the physical characteristics encoded by those genes, and we actually know many of those genes already. But there are other things that we don't know exactly which gene, but we know they're controlled by genetics because we can track how they vary within families and within the population. So, for example, something like height is 80 to 90% due to variation in genes, even though we don't know most of those genes currently because there are so many of them and they're hard to detect. So those are the two primary things that I would try to say in terms of the genetic inheritance. Genes that have a large effect, we know which genes they are. So the gene for blue eyes, we know that gene. And then there's many genes which affect very important complicated traits, and those we don't know the exact gene, but we know that they're there.
And tell me, before we get into the grandparents and all of that, let's just look basically at what genes are recessive and what genes are, what do you call them, dominant?
So the thing is this is like a technical point, but I think it's an important one. Genes themselves are not recessive or dominant. It's how they're expressed in a specific trait. So to give you an example, the gene that controls most of the variation in eye color in Europeans, so it's responsible for the mostly recessive inheritance pattern of blue eyes, it also has other effects. And one of those other effects is in skin color. And in skin color, it doesn't have a dominant or recessive effect. It has an in-between effect, right? Uh-huh. So it depends on the context of the trait you're looking at. So recessive and dominant inheritance patterns are very easy to track, and they're very clear, and they're very intuitive, but they're actually only a small fraction of the variation you see.
You're studying this, so you, of course, are deeply interested in this, but you also have this personal deep interest. Last year, you write, you sent a sample of your then 2-month-old daughter's genetic material to this firm and analyzed her results. What were you expecting to get from that firm, and why did you have her tested?
I like information. I had my whole family tested. I had myself tested. I'm curious. I wanted to get as much of her genotype as I could get because I was going to get it anyway, and I want to do it as soon as possible. As I mentioned in the article, I do have a condition which is treatable. Like, I'm fine. Don't worry about my life expectancy. But I do have a condition that's inherited in a dominant fashion. So I carry one copy of a gene, and so 50% of my offspring have a chance of carrying that gene. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, at some point if she had that. So that was one of the reasons we got her tested.
And you found out she didn't.
No, she did not. And, we're jumping ahead here, but the way we figured that out was because I actually had my mom tested, and I know that she is the one that I get the trait from. We don't actually know which specific base pair the problem is occurring in, but I know that I get it from her. And so that's why my wife, she looked at that segment, that region, and knew that it came from my dad.
So what happens? It would just appear to be sort of a common wisdom that we would get from our grandparents, that we would get 25% of our ancestry from each, but you say that we don't genetically. Well, how did that happen? Yeah,
well, so what you expect is 25%. So when you average it out across the population, but there's a huge variance in there. So what happens is, so you have each gene, you have two copies, right? You get one from your mother and one from your father, right?
Right.
But your parents also have two, one from their mother and one from their father, right?
Right.
So you can't split the genes in half. This isn't like Solomon's baby. You can't split the chromosomes in half. You have two copies, and you give one or the other. So you give your maternal or your paternal. And so for example, with my daughter, say chromosome 1, I have a copy from my mother and I have a copy from my father, right?
Right.
I'm going to contribute one via my sperm, either my father's or my mother's, not both. Okay? So you can have a pattern where you get more from one parent than the other, okay? And the one thing that I do also want to say is there's something called recombination, which mixes up your parental copies. So I actually, I know this because I know my whole family's pedigree. So my daughter does not actually have, I don't think she has any chromosome, well, except for one, a small one. That's from just one of her grandparents. She actually has chromosomes that have combinations due to something called recombination. And anyway, that adds another layer of complexity. But basically, there are multiple things that are going on, and it's like the roll of a dice. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you roll a dice, you expect to get a 50-50 chance. But if you only roll it 5 times, well, you can't get 2.5, you know? You're going to get a 3 or you're going to get a 2. You know, you're not going to get exact values. There's going to be some noise in the process, and that's what's happening.
Yeah, all right. I kind of lost you when you were talking about this recombination. It's recombination. What does that mean, and how does recombination manifest itself in our human structure?
Okay, so let's think about the longest chromosome is chromosome 1. So you have this long chromosome, and basically they're 2 strings. I'm sure you've seen them, right, in some sort of depiction.
Yeah.
So they're 2 lines, right? And so what happens is when you produce sex cells like sperm or eggs, what happens is your 2 chromosomes, they mix and match. They start swapping pieces, okay? And so that's recombination. So you get a segment from one half, it moves to the other arm, and you get a segment from one arm, and it swaps to the other arm, okay? And so each one of your chromosomes, usually they're actually a combination of sorts. They're a synthesis between your parental chromosomes. So it's a little more complicated than saying that, oh, well, I'm just contributing my father's chromosome or I'm contributing my mother's chromosome. Actually, there are some chromosomes where it's 80% my father and 20% my mother. So, I mean, it is pretty complicated, but in terms of the outcome, there are individuals who are, 20% one grandparent and 30% the other, or even 10% one and 40% the other. Okay? I mean, that's in terms of like brass tacks.
Yeah.
There are people who are much more like one grandparent than the other because there's a noise in this process, right? So if you flip a quarter 10 times, sometimes you are going to get 10 straight heads. That's not magic. That's just probability, right? So sometimes you're going to be extremely biased towards one grandparent. And that's what I was trying to get across.
And is that new information for us? Have we just discovered this?
Theoretically, we knew that for decades. But previous to genomics, which is the ability basically to read our sequence very easily, it was much more difficult to ascertain. I mean, intuitively, people knew it. I think in terms of people are sometimes like one grandparent or the other, but we didn't really understand what fraction.
I see. And why have you had all these people in your family tested for, what are you doing here? Your aunts and your uncles and everybody. Why?
Because I can.
Because you can.
Know, I mean,
but what do you want to learn from it?
I'll give you a concrete example. So there's various things you can do. Like health is something people are super interested in, although a lot of people fear that. But in any case, let's set that aside. So my family's from Bangladesh, and we know something about our ancestry. So I have mostly from Bangladesh. We've lived there for a long time, and so I looked at my parents' genotypes. I looked at the sequence or the genotypes that I got, the million markers that are varied, that give a lot of information, right? This was about 2010. I looked at it, and I found out that about 15% of both of their ancestry was from Eastern Asia, okay? Burma, Thailand, that sort of area, which is actually very close. But the thing is when I talked to them about it, they had no idea. They were really confused, okay? What has recently been found out is the population of Bangladesh had absorbed a population from Eastern Asia about 1,000 years ago, okay? Researchers looked at a bunch of Bangladeshis. They exhibited the exact same pattern as my parents. Now, it happens, I knew this 3 years ago because I had two samples, one from both of my parents. They had the exact same pattern. I could actually look at the length of the segments, and I intuited that it was probably on the order of 1,000 years ago, okay? So I knew that before researchers had published it, just because I could.
Right. Well, because you're studying all this too, right?
That's part of it, but I mean, honestly, there are people who build their own computers, that do all sorts of things. I mean, this isn't rocket science; it's genetics.
Yeah. So, what happened in the article? You talk about your father being quite proud of his disproportionate contribution to his granddaughter. Your mother-in-law, no complaints about being overrepresented in the genetic constitution of her first grandchild. But what about the others?
They have a good attitude about it.
Oh, they do. That's good.
Yeah, they have a good attitude. I mean, it all averages out.
How so?
In the end. Yeah. We hope to have more children. So.
So you'll see.
Yeah.
You'll get your turn next go around.
Yeah, that's what I tell them.
Yeah. So you indicate that all of this